All right, good morning, folks. We have a special guest here today, Scott Osheroff. Scott is a fund manager for Asia Frontier Capital, and he's got an interesting fund we're going to learn a lot about today. The reason that we're having Scott on today is because a couple weeks ago, Doug and I had a conversation about alternative assets. And at that time, he recently had a call with Scott to discuss this very interesting fund he has in Uzbekistan. And so, this certainly is something that's so far off the radar for most people. And the truth is, it seems like you have to go pretty far off the radar to find things of value in the world today. And Scott's finding it. So, Scott, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell us about your.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Doug.
No, I was gonna. No, go ahead. I was going to say.
Okay, I'll just get so tell us a little bit about your fund. Tell us about why Uzbekistan, and specifically what your fund's objectives are.
Sure. So I've been working with Asia Frontier Capital for, I believe, 9 years next month. And it actually, the Uzbekistan fund started as an accident. I was living in Myanmar, between Myanmar and Cambodia at the time, and I got asked to come to Kazakhstan for an investor tour. Kazakhstan was promoting itself as opening up, doing a massive privatization of the economy at the time, of which roughly 70% of GDP was courtesy of the government. They were going to do dual listing IPOs of four big companies: Kazatomprom, the uranium company, I think Uztransgas, Kazpost, the national airline Air Astana, and really, there wasn't that much on the local stock market. It was more of a corporate bond market. But since I was in the region, I tacked on Kyrgyzstan. So I was in Bishkek for 2 days. And Uzbekistan had just opened up. Uzbekistan was sort of a North Korea #2 under the former president, Islam Karimov, from the fall of the Soviet Union up until his death in 2016, where his prime minister since 2003, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, got elected president. And everyone thought things were going to remain the same, but actually he took a 180 and said, we're opening up the country, we're liberalizing the place. Since forced labor in the cotton industry has officially been eliminated, cotton bans have been eliminated in terms of textile companies purchasing from them, freedom of speech has improved, bureaucracy in the country has been trimmed down tremendously. Of course, there's much more to go, et cetera, et cetera. So I figured I'd come and take a look, and spent a week here and was absolutely shocked that we live in the day and age where if an earthquake happens in some part of the world, you hear about it on Google or Yahoo 2 minutes later. Uzbekistan had been open at that point for a year and a half, and no one was talking about it. The country wasn't really in the media yet. There's a stock market with about 600 companies between the main board and the OTC. And back then, you had companies that were trading at PEs of 2 and 3 times with dividend yields of 20, 30, 40%. And that were growing their earnings at 400, 500, 600%. Not exaggerations, by the way. And some of them are still growing at 500, 600% year over year, their earnings. So was thinking, why is no one here? And we realized that we were early. So we decided to start investing here through our umbrella fund, our Asia Frontier Fund, which is one of our 4 funds that invests in frontier markets throughout Frontier Asia. And then in March of 2019, we launched a dedicated Uzbekistan fund. And really the focus is getting exposure to cheap companies in a growing economy that's very much under leveraged, that should in due course, over the next decade or so, emerge into being not only the geopolitical superpower for the region, for Central Asia, which right now it's sort of Kazakhstan, but also the economic powerhouse of the region, and riding that wave.
Why do you think it'll emerge as the leader in Central Asia?
One, it has the largest population, so it's got 35 million people. Kazakhstan, I think, has 17 million. And it also has a diversified economy. Geographically, it's the center of Central Asia. It conveniently does have the biggest military. And since President Mirziyoyev took over, they've resolved a lot of border conflicts. They, for example, used to not be able to cross a land border into Kyrgyzstan or into Tajikistan. Now you can, no problem. There were water rights issues. So a lot of that has been solved. border demarcations have been, established. But Uzbekistan has also taken a very firm sort of footing, if you will, in involvement in negotiations with the Taliban prior to the U.S. pulling out. For about 2 or 3 years prior, there had been negotiations with them through in Qatar, and a lot of transit and trade actually goes through Afghanistan. So the country has been involved in regional politics, if you will, much more actively than anyone else in the region. But then also, again, economically, it's a fast-growing country. Last year, it grew at 7% after growing, I believe, 1.2 or 1.3% the prior year. So one of the few countries that grew year over year in 2020, 2021. So those are a few of the reasons that it's likely to emerge as the big influencing country in the region.
Doug, what appeals to you about this fund? I mean, maybe you can tell everyone about your, what drew you to this initially, and why, and what your investment view is of it.
Well, I haven't been to Uzbekistan, but I've been to Kazakhstan a couple of times and Kyrgyzstan a couple of times. And these are countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, but almost nobody knows they exist. I'm guessing that only 1 out of 100 Americans, maybe less, have even heard about Uzbekistan. They've all heard of Kazakhstan because of Borat, of course. But if it wasn't for Borat, nobody would have even heard about Kazakhstan. So it's attractive to me because they're obscure and nobody knows about them. But when I was there, I saw lots of problems as well as lots of opportunities. For instance, tribalism. You've got Uzbeks and Kyrgyz and Pathans and Farsis and God knows how many groups there are, but they don't get along with each other very well. How's the tribal situation in Uzbekistan and the other stands, as far as you can tell?
That's perhaps largely a result of how the that's probably largely a result of how the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, drew the lines, the borders of these countries to instigate conflict. If you look at the western border of Uzbekistan, it is a straight line, purposely cutting them off from the Caspian Sea. So Uzbekistan, definitely, as you said, it has Tajiks, it has, I sort of call Uzbekistan the United Nations of nationalities. You have Koreans, you have Tatars, Russians, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Turkmens, Afghans. You have a small German population. You have Armenians, Georgians. It's a very diverse community, and it used to be more diverse, but that doesn't seem to be much of an issue. People get along in the country. Again, part of the reason for conflicts in the general region have largely been, in my opinion, border dispute related. If you look at the city of Osh, which I believe is the second largest city in Kyrgyzstan, which is right across the border from Uzbekistan, it is a city of Uzbeks. It's technically, arguably, you could say it's Uzbekistan, but it's on the other side of the border. So that's where a lot of these border disputes have come from. So I don't notice a lot of tribalism. You probably see a bit more of it in Kazakhstan because it's a nomadic society where you have different tribal clans, if you will. But in Uzbekistan, you don't have so much. It's a very secular country in that regard.
Okay, and do the different tribes speak their native languages, or do they use Russian as a lingua franca?
In Uzbekistan, historically, the language of business and politics has been Russian, but that's very much changing to Uzbek. So as you're seeing in Kazakhstan as well, where nationalism is taking hold, and people are trying to distance themselves from Russian influence. So it's happening in the entire region where people are taking up their own national language. And you certainly have issues with people that have grown up in the country who've been successful and whatnot, who don't speak Uzbek. So there is a bit of tension there, but it's something you could see even when I first came here, and it's always been there. Now it's accelerating, if you will.
But are the Uzbeks actually the dominant group in Uzbekistan, and by what
Yes.
degree?
By what degree, I'm not sure, but the vast majority.
Okay, because the other thing that came up to me that I noticed when I was in that part of the world was the religious situation. And of course, as part of the old Soviet Union, everybody was officially an atheist, of course. But in point of fact, I noticed that in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, these people were either Christians of some type or Muslims. And how is that sorting out these days between those two major religions?
This is a region of Islam, to put it frankly. And under the former president, and as you saw under other presidents in countries bordering Uzbekistan, as you said, religion was suppressed. Now what you're seeing is something which has very likely always been there, whether it's fasting for Ramadan, wearing hijabs, going to a mosque more often, which people wanted to do, but they either didn't do it because it was regarded as taboo or for other reasons. So you're definitely seeing the rise in Islamification of the region throughout all of Central Asia, as you have seen in Turkey over the past 2 decades. So that's very much the trend.
And one of the things about Islam is that people tend to take it much more seriously and observe the tenets and bow towards Mecca 5 times a day. They take it much more seriously than the Christians do. Do you see that as being a problem in the future?
Potentially. But I don't know necessarily a problem. I think that if you look at where the investment, in my opinion, and Matt and I were talking about this before we jumped on with the recording, I look at this region, sort of Central Asia, all the way down to the Middle East, including Iran and Turkey. I like to call this region the New Fertile Crescent from an economic standpoint, because of the low debt, the young population, and the investment opportunities, but also the protectionist policies that have been in place in one way or another, for one reason or another, say Iran with sanctions, Uzbekistan self-imposed, which put this region in a very good position going forward into a world of shortages and deglobalization. But therefore, I see the majority of the investment into this part of the world coming from the Middle East, coming from Iran. Slowly but surely, if sanctions get lifted, you'll see a lot more. They're going to dominate this region because they're a manufacturing powerhouse for the region. There's huge Turkish investment as well. There was a lot of Turkish investment here, restaurants, manufacturing, et cetera, 2 decades ago, and they were kicked out of the country. They're increasingly coming back. So I don't look at that as a risk or a negative issue. It's going to be integrated into the wider region, where again you're going to see that this is it's always been a Islamic or Muslim part of the world. It's just going to show where under the Soviet Union it didn't show.
So how many Russians, ethnic Russians are left in Uzbekistan at this point?
Can't tell you an exact number, but it's falling. A lot of people are leaving the country, even ethnic Koreans and whatnot. And it's not necessarily due to religion. Historically, it was due to lack of economic opportunity. When the Soviet Union collapsed, you had a huge portion of Russians, East Germans, Czechs, et cetera, Georgians, Armenians that were here. And a lot of them went back to their country of origin. So you still have a decent portion of Russians, ethnic Russians and Tatars in the country. But that was a result of, historically it was a result of them leaving the country due to economic opportunities.
And what is it at this point? Why are they leaving now?
Some of them are, some of them aren't. Some of them are coming back. I know a handful that have come back, that are repatriated. So it depends. I mean, what I have learned by living in, I think, 5 countries in Asia over the past decade is that, it's the grass is always greener. Living in Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Mongolia, you always meet people that say, of course, I want to leave my country. I want to go to America. Are you crazy? Why would I stay here? And, I'm running towards the chaos. So I have a lot of friends who are Uzbeks, either ethnic or ethnic Russians, that have lived in the US, the UK, Germany, Austria, throughout the Middle East, that have been very successful. And they've come back because they see huge opportunity here. So you see it both ways. And again, I was an adjunct professor for a year at 2 different universities here. And I loved asking my students, do you want to leave the country? And it was actually interesting because at a private university, everyone raised their hand and said, of course I want to leave the country. They want to go to Europe or America. And they don't realize that $100,000 in America, or let's say in San Francisco, is not a lot of money. And at the state school that I was an adjunct professor at, I was actually really surprised because I asked the same question. And out of 80 students between 2 separate classes, so about 40 students each, maybe 15 or 20 of them said they wanted to leave. And then I asked why. And half of them said they want to get master's degrees or experience and then come back. So something has changed in the country.
So what, after the Soviet Union broke up, a nasty dictator, what was his name, ran the country, and for how many years?
Islam Karimov. So he ran the country until 2016. He passed away in September of 2016.
And then what happened? And why did it happen?
His prime minister, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, who'd been prime minister since 2003, became president. So he was elected president in, I believe, December of 2016. And as I mentioned earlier, everyone expected the status quo to remain. But once he got elected, he came out with a 5-pillar reform program, reforming everything from the judiciary to investment to education, and open up the country. And that's why you see a big privatization program going on. Again, as I mentioned, there was significant forced labor in Uzbekistan, in the cotton industry in particular. During the autumn, all the schools would be emptied, hospitals, all government offices would pretty much be emptied, and people would go to the fields to pick cotton. The International Labor Organization came out last month saying that the cotton harvest for 2021 showed no forced labor or child labor. It's all gone. And actually, the price people are getting paid to pick cotton is now so attractive that in the autumn, you're seeing people willingly go out because they're getting a better salary picking cotton than they would doing other menial jobs, whether it's a factory job or cleaning the streets or whatnot. So it's become a job that people look forward to. It's been truly remarkable.
Is there anywhere
It
else?
was a police state.
Is there anywhere else in the world where they had compulsory labor like that? Other than maybe North Korea, as recently as 2016 or 2018. I mean, that seems shocking.
Not that I'm aware of to this degree. And again, I remember until February of 2018, there's a beautiful metro system in this country because Tashkent was destroyed in an earthquake in 1966, I believe, and it was rebuilt with money from all of the Soviet satellites as well as Russia. And until February 2018, it was illegal to go and take photos of the subway because it was considered a quote unquote strategic asset. Now you can go take photos. So things like that, getting stopped on the street every 200 meters by a police officer asking for your passport, where are you going, why are you here, getting interrogated at the airport. It doesn't exist anymore. That you come here now, you would never imagine that just 5 years ago that was the situation on the ground. It's completely changed.
When's the next election, Scott?
The last election was October of last year. So elections are every 4 years.
So is there any chance then that this has happened in so many countries around the world that seemed to be going in the right direction and became very prosperous very quickly, and after X number of years, It's usually more like 10 or 15 years. Uh, they figure they're rich enough now that they can vote out free market policies and go back to the good old days. So what are the chances of that happening in Uzbekistan?
I think very low. And the reason I think that there's a low chance of that happening is because no one knows what the reason is for why the president, you know, veered off course and liberalized and opened up the country. What I learned in Myanmar is that if, when it went from being a military dictatorship to a semi-civilian government and then a democracy, is that you can make a lot of money in a country that attracts foreign investment. But also, this country had a huge issue with structural unemployment. And so the population here is about 35 million people. They're adding about 900,000 per year. And the big challenge is you have a huge portion of the population. Keep in mind, the average age is just under 30 years old, going through the education system. And how do you employ them? How do you help people get a better quality of life? Because otherwise you have issues. So I think that's one of the reasons that they opened up. And the population is set to reach 40 million, I think, by 2040. So it's growing very quickly. And I think that's something that probably keeps them on their toes. Is we need to not only figure out ways to employ people, which includes diversifying the economy, decreasing state involvement in the economy, but also finding ways to remove government bureaucracy to allow people to become entrepreneurial and to build wealth. And when you look at the concentration of wealth in the country, sure, you have a high degree of concentration as you do in a lot of the developing world. But if you compare the concentration of wealth in Uzbekistan relative to Kazakhstan or Tajikistan or Turkmenistan, it's night and day. And that's just going off of private conversations that I've had and my observations over the past decade of looking at the region. Uzbekistan has a very diversified economy.
It sounds like you'd think there's a lot less corruption, endemic corruption, for whatever reason, in Uzbekistan than there are in its neighbors. What do you think about that?
100%. 100%. And it was funny when I first came to the region and I was in Kazakhstan, I remember seeing in both Astana and in Almaty, there were little shops everywhere and they said notarius, and it means notary. There are notaries. There are as many notaries in Kazakh cities as there probably were gas stations in the United States in the 1980s. 3 on a corner or three at an intersection. They're everywhere, and the bureaucracy in Kazakhstan, in my experience, is phenomenal. Uzbekistan's shedding it. For example, and again, Uzbekistan has a long ways to go in terms of bureaucracy. Corruption, you used to have to pay money if you got stopped by the police, like happens in a lot of countries. Well, the Uzbek government figured out an easy way to get rid of that. They force all traffic police to wear cameras. You don't pay bribes anymore. They're gone. Simple as that. And then you look at, for example, the capital markets. Well, firstly, a lot of license applications are all being digitized. You want to get a driver's license, one aspect of it is digitized. So you can't pay your way to get a driver's license anymore. And with the stock market, for example, there is huge bureaucracy in opening up a brokerage account from the standpoint of, if you're not in the country, you need to fill out documentation. It needs to get an apostille. It needs to be sent to Uzbekistan, translated into Russian. There's some positive news coming down the pike in that regard in terms of eliminating a lot of that bureaucracy and perhaps digitizing the process over the coming months. So the government here is doing a very good job of decreasing bureaucracy as well as trying to tackle corruption.
So what's the level of taxes in Uzbekistan, and how does it compare to the other ex-Soviet stands around it?
I won't get too much into the tax system here because it is phenomenally complicated. And they passed new tax legislation a few years ago, which still makes it complicated. If you're a small business, I think you can choose to pay, rather than a profit tax, I think you can choose to pay 4% of your revenues as tax. There's a handful of options, but all in all, I think corporate tax is about 12%. So it's not high. In the stock market, there are no capital gains taxes, and the dividend tax is 5%.
Oh,
Well, it's 5% for
well, in
foreign
today's
corporates and
world,
0% for individuals.
hmm. Well, in today's world, that's a very favorable tax regime. There's no question about it. Now you said there's 600 publicly traded companies, and they're privatizing more. So by the time they finish with this program of privatization, how many companies will be listed on the Uzbek exchange?
Well, so there's about 135 companies listed on the Tashkent Stock Exchange. The balance of those 600 are on the OTC market. So some of those are going to be privatized, and then there will be some fully private companies which will be IPO'd. So not a whole lot more. They have a plan to privatize through the stock exchange 14 companies, and then they're privatizing the pretty much the, I don't want to say the entire economy, but they're privatizing the crown jewels of the economy, which includes the largest steel mill in the country, one of the biggest copper gold mines in the world, one of the biggest gold mining operations in the world. So those are two separate companies. The national oil and gas, transportation company with all the pipelines. These companies, along with a handful of banks and insurance companies, will be privatized through the stock market. A lot of the smaller assets or smaller companies, whether they're factories, land, for example, this is all being privatized through an auction system, and it's an online auction platform. So if one wants to participate, they have to have a local company so they can have a local tax ID. You go and register in the system, put a deposit down for the assets you want to participate in the auction on, and thereafter, you're off to the races. So they are privatizing pretty much everything.
So it's not practical for me to try to open a brokerage account in Uzbekistan from abroad. But supposing I'm boots on the ground in Uzbekistan, how hard is it then?
How long does it take you to sign your name? It takes maximum 5 minutes to open a brokerage account.
Interesting.
No notary of your passport, no apostille, anything. You fill out 3 pieces of paper at your broker, and that's pretty much it. You wait 3 days, and they will send you your online password and username for the online trading system. So there's an online, it's all online trading here via a Korean platform. So you just have to wait 3 days for that to be sent to you. But otherwise, opening the account effectively takes 5 minutes. And again, in a few months, you will be able to do all of this without stepping foot in the country.
Oh, now this all sounds really good, quite frankly. What's the major agricultural crop? Is it cotton?
Right now, it's cotton. But
And
cotton productions, go ahead.
I was going to say, and where do they get the water? They get that from the Sea of Azov?
No, and the RLC, well, I guess the RLC is the termination point. So the rivers, the Amudarya and the Sudarya, they come from the country's neighbors. So Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And that's one reason that the government is focused on. Oh, go ahead.
Because what I seem to remember was that it was the Aral Sea, not the Sea of Azov, I'm sorry, that it was actually being drained and it was drying up because of all the water that was being pumped out of it because cotton is a notorious water hog as a crop. So what's going to happen to the cotton industry at this point? And what's happening to the Aral Sea as a result of all this?
Well, let's start with your second question. If you go on Google Maps or Google Earth and you look at the RLC and you look at the Kazakh-Uzbek border, the Kazakhs built a dam pretty much right on the border. So the Kazakh side is beginning to slowly refill. The Uzbek government is working to try and remediate the area, increase the amount of water flow, also plant trees and whatnot to decrease the amount of dust storms. It will take a generation to fix. And I believe they're getting help from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development funding through a handful of programs to try and slowly but surely resolve the issue. But really, the only way to resolve it is to increase water flow into the RLC. And this is a result of the Soviets and their phenomenal central planning for the reason that the RLC has virtually vanished. And the water efficiency for agriculture in Uzbekistan is terrible. So the ability cotton production is beginning to slowly decrease a little bit. It's tapering off as the country is switching to more horticultural products. It's the breadbasket of the entire region from a fruit, vegetable, nut standpoint. But you're seeing increasing use of technologies. Well, firstly, basic greenhouses, but you're seeing drip irrigation. You're seeing the early introduction of vertical farming, and that's going to allow for a rapid decrease in water intensity in agriculture. And again, cotton will still be there, but the intention is to slowly but surely shift away from cotton and to other value-added products.
Interesting.
What's the big problem that you see? What can go wrong with this blossoming success story, Scott?
Time and capacity. What I've learned by my interactions with government and watching what's been happening in this country, the big challenge is that when I first came here in 2018, there were a handful of decrees being signed every week to change this and to change that. And it was really a matter of capacity. I think there was a governor in the south of the country who said, there's so many decrees being signed, I couldn't implement half of them if I wanted to. Doesn't have the manpower, and even if he had the manpower, he wouldn't have the intellectual manpower to be able to execute. So it's literally a country going from North Korea to trying to become a emerging market overnight. It's going to take a decade, and that's the opportunity, I think, is that it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take time. So that's the biggest challenge, I'd say. And then another obvious one is the jurisdiction. As you said, a lot of people in the West say, firstly, they don't even perhaps ask, where is Uzbekistan? They say, what is Uzbekistan? Or did you say Uzbekistan? And, for example, the fact that this country last week or the week before broke ground on a railway, which is going to cut through Afghanistan into Pakistan. Not a part of the world a lot of people pay attention to, but let's just say it's easier to do business in Afghanistan now than it was a year ago, according to friends that are in logistics. So that logistics corridor is going to be huge, but it's not going to be really on the radar of Western investors and whatnot. So again, the question is, with the neighborhood that Central Asia's in, where's the money going to come from to help turn this country from a GDP per capita of $1,700 to $5,000 or $10,000? I think it's going to be Chinese and Middle Eastern money, and of course, in due course, it's going to be Russian capital. There's significant Russian capital investment here, a lot of debt financing as well, which unfortunately a lot of that debt financing is in the process of being refinanced because of sanctions. So that's a bit of a setback, but the neighborhood is, I think, worrisome to a lot of people. You tell people it's a former Soviet republic and they sort of step back a little bit. And Doug, as you mentioned, you've been to Kazakhstan before. Kazakhstan has the resources to be a very, very rich country. Yet, at the end of the day, they're really just an exporter of unprocessed crude oil and a little bit of grains and copper cathode, some gold, of course, gas. Value added wise, they're not a country focused on adding value, and most of those assets and industries are controlled by the government. So there's huge opportunity in the region, but you need to treat investors right, and you need to do a good job of attracting them. So that's Uzbekistan's challenge now, and the big challenge, and I actually faced this when I first came here, is having lived in Mongolia for roughly 2 years. I had no clue what to expect when I first came to Uzbekistan, but I will say that I was absolutely shocked. In Tashkent, the ring roads are all 4 or 5 lanes each direction. There's not a pothole in sight. The roads in this country, on the main roads in this country, are better than 95% of roads in America. There's a high-speed rail that cuts through the western half of the country and which is being extended, self-financed by the government because they have about 65% of their GDP in FX reserves. But it's not Chinese technology, it's Spanish technology. So the country has a lot of things going for it, but as I mentioned, it does have a lot of challenges, but as does every country.
Well, in the meantime,
say, Scott,
go ahead, Doug.
One question, Matt. I was just going to say, did you say, Scott, that maybe I misheard you, the GDP per capita is only $1,600 or $1,700? That seems way too low.
That's correct.
Wow.
And the reason for,
well,
again, the reason, sorry, go ahead.
To me, that smells like opportunity, because I'm sure that you've seen that cover of the New Yorker magazine, which was kind of a takeoff of their cover of the United States as viewed from New York. And so they had all these stands, including what the fuck a stand, forget about it stand. And Americans don't know anything about this part of the world, except they see it as being radical, dangerous, and next door to Afghanistan and Pakistan. But listen, you're making this sound very, very interesting, frankly, to me. But go ahead, Matt, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about your fund in particular. If you could just tell us a little bit about the fund, the way it's structured, what your investment objectives are with it, and maybe a couple of the companies that you've invested in already, and just tell us more about the fund itself and the way your investment approach.
Sure. So our headquarters, the headquarters of Asian Frontier Capital, are in Hong Kong, and we're licensed there. Our fund for Uzbekistan is domiciled in Cayman, and we have a feeder fund, so we accept U.S. investors. So we're licensed there. And then our administrator is in Singapore. And then we just have brokerage accounts in Uzbekistan. So I actually don't need to be here. I've just found it easier to operate from here. And of course, with COVID, it was hard to find a place to run and hide. And actually, this country did a very good job of dealing with COVID. So we have about $18 million under management. We started again in March of 2019. So we just had our 3-year anniversary. And the focus is really getting exposure solely in the equity market. We don't do any private equity. We don't do debt. Getting exposure to companies that will benefit from the long-term growth of the country. So getting exposure via construction materials, financial services, consumer goods, the same type of things that you see or have seen in places like China, or more recently in Vietnam, where you have a country that becomes a manufacturing powerhouse, which Uzbekistan has the largest industrial and manufacturing and agricultural base in the entire region. So I do like to call it a mini regional Vietnam, and it has significant textile capacity as well. So the focus is getting exposure to these types of themes. So our biggest holdings are in the areas of steel, cement, consumer goods via the largest winery, which also produces, well, they produce spirits, non-alcoholic beverages, dried fruits, et cetera, et cetera. And then banks. Again, as you saw in Southeast Asia, a decade or two ago, you had high inflation, of which 4 or 5 years ago in Uzbekistan, inflation was 18-19%. Right now, inflation is 10%. And a month ago, before the invasion of Ukraine, inflation was about 9.8%. So it's coming down because the central bank has an inflation targeting regime with the focus of getting it to, I believe, about 6% this year. And where the world's headed, they probably won't achieve it. But at the very least, the Western world is going to see, and other emerging markets are going to see their inflation rates rise up to where Uzbekistan is, which will make it look less extreme. or is the case with some countries, they'll well surpass Uzbekistan's inflation rate. But the real story, if you will, beyond investment is the cost of capital. If you're able to get financing from a bank, you're paying 25 to 30%. And the policy rate just jumped 300 basis points, the central bank rate, to 17% from 14%, again, because of the volatility with Russia and Ukraine. But the banks are very much undercapitalized, because if the central bank wasn't holding them back, credit growth in this country would be 50 or 60%. The demand for credit is huge, because what I learned when I first came to this region, actually in Kyrgyzstan, before I came to Uzbekistan, is that companies in this part of the world and entrepreneurs in this part of the world don't have debt. Everything is self-financed, and they grow organically because the cost of capital is so high. And looking at this country, and again, it sort of has rhyming aspects to that of Vietnam, is the banks get further infusions of capital either via euro bonds, or they increase their equity and get foreign strategic partners involved. There's going to be more competition in the marketplace to loan out capital. And when the cost of capital gets to 20% or 18% or 15%, and again, this will take several years, but as that cost of capital begins to normalize, all you need to do is look at any other sort of Asian tiger, if you will, or China or Korea, to see what could potentially happen in this part of the world. And Doug, sort of going back to the stock market for a second, for something you mentioned a little while ago, dividends here are pretty good. You can get dividend yields of between, say, 5 and 15%. But the problem is that a term deposit rate at the bank is 20, 21, 22% in local currency. In dollars, you can get 6 or 7%. But again, is that banks have more capital and they're less capital starved. That cost of capital that they lend out for is going to come down, and their deposit rates are therefore going to come down. And as that happens, I imagine you'll see a large amount of local capital looking for a home, and I imagine it's going to find its way into the stock market. And in terms of illiteracy, I was speaking with someone in government last week, and we were talking about this, and the financial literacy of people, say civil servants, if you will, figuring out how to allocate cash beyond a term deposit and beyond real estate is, let's just say, increasing very quickly. And the attraction of the stock market is increasing very quickly. So, Matt, sorry for jumping around a bit and getting off track.
This is good.
But that's what we want exposure to, is these types of themes, which again are not going to be one-year themes, but multi-year.
Well, okay, you have a small fund now. It's only $18 million, which is teeny weeny. Supposing $5 million or 10 or $50 million wanted to get into your fund, could you actually invest that much money properly over a reasonable period of time? How would you go about it?
I believe we could. So a few things are happening. One, again, I said that the banks are all undercapitalized. We could actually go and negotiate with some of the banks, the private banks, in that regard, and become, if you will, sort of a strategic investor, a long-term investor, because they don't want hot money flows as shareholders, if you will. But to be able to go and negotiate with them larger blocks of shares and have them issue new equity to us. So that's one option to deploy capital. But also, as I mentioned, over the next few years, you're going to see the privatization of roughly 14 companies. Right now, it's 14 companies, but that's subject to change, of course, either up or down, depending on the situation. So right now, this year, the largest auto manufacturer in the country, which is state-owned, called Uzavto, is going to IPO. And it's to be determined what the size will be, but it should be well north of $10 million. And when I say well north, it could be 50 or 100 million. The steel company, which is our largest holding right now, called Uzmet Kombinat, and it's the largest steel company. It sort of has a monopoly position in Uzbekistan. The government's going to be doing a partial privatization of shares. They own roughly 81% of the company, and they're going to be selling that down. So you'll have another big liquidity event there. And then probably in the third or fourth quarter, you're going to have a company called Al Malik IPO, which right now is 100% state owned. It's funny because when you look at lists of the world's largest copper mines, Uzbekistan was closed and so secretive about, especially among other things, its resource holdings, minerals, whether it was uranium or gold. And Al Malik is one of the 5 biggest copper mines in the world. And it's undergoing I believe, $6 billion expansion to take one super pit and merge it with another super pit, which when it's completed in roughly 2028 is going to be 10 kilometers wide. So this company is going through, well, it's going to be IPO'd later this year. And again, I imagine that is somewhere in the $50 to $100 million range. So we're just on the cusp of there being real significant liquidity in the stock market. And it's going to be the government's challenge, of course, to figure out how to attract capital, both foreign and local, to participate in these privatizations. But the liquidity is definitely going to be there if you have capital to deploy.
If someone wants to invest in your fund, what are some of the requirements? Do they need to be an accredited investor if they're American, for instance? What are the minimum amounts? What kind of lockup period should they expect? Just what are the basic parameters you're looking for?
Sure. So we've got a large number of American investors, so we've raised our minimum to $50,000. For non-US, it's $10,000, and we offer liquidity, so redemptions every month, but with a 3-month notice, and there's no lockup otherwise.
Okay. All right. And if people want to find out more about your fund, go ahead, Doug. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think it's an extremely attractive story because, especially for an American that wants to diversify, because of where your management and so forth is located, it's not in the United States even. So it's a part of the world nobody's looking at, with potentially very high capital gains, excellent argument for it, high dividend yields, limited political risks from the viewpoint of the American government. I mean, it's an attractive story. Of course, having also spent time in Burma and Mongolia in the past, I thought they would be interesting, but I was wrong. They weren't. Uzbekistan actually does sound interesting, genuinely.
Well, if I can add one point to that, Doug, I think we can all agree, the three of us, that the world is entering a period, or it's already in a period of deglobalization, and you're going to see the increasing resource nationalism, increasing protectionism. It's sort of a blessing in disguise that the former president, Islam Karimov, was very focused on import substitution, as is the current president, but to a much lesser degree. But this country has the largest, most diversified, again, industrial and agricultural, from a value-added standpoint, base in the entire region. It also has huge commodity reserves of gold, zinc, silver, copper. It's relatively self-sufficient in gas. From an agricultural standpoint, it's 93% self-sufficient in protein. So they import 7% of their protein demand. The rest of it's grown here or raised here. So in a world where it's probably going to be very good to have low, external debts, have a lot of gold, and be relatively self-sufficient, I think that every country in the world is going to be impacted with where we're heading in the world. But I think that the question to ask as an investor is, where can you position yourself where you're going to get impacted the least? And I liked Uzbekistan when I first came here, but as you saw supply chain issues and the ESG movement and all of this accelerate along with COVID, I increasingly started thinking, Uzbekistan, for all intents and purposes, is not a bad place to be hiding, and also gaining upside. So that's something that has emerged as very much as a plus for this country as well.
Yeah, and I think if you see something with a GDP of $1,700 per person and a growing population, it's not, can't really go down. I mean, there's really only upside from here at that rate. I mean, that's a very, very low level to start the base from. So that's very interesting. I kind of expected this to be a story of, that it had a bunch of resources that could be exploited, rather than a story that already has a very diversified economy and a lot of, value-added services already. So I didn't actually know that at all. I'm sure you did, Doug, better than I did, but it's interesting.
I'm looking for the fly in the ointment. I'm looking
Me
for
too.
I'm looking for the critical flaw here that could blow up this otherwise very appealing and unknown story. And it doesn't occur to me at the moment. What about you, Matt? You see
No,
the problem you see?
I don't. I think if it's I'm an American, so there's a $50,000 minimum. I think I'm going to set up an account. Scott, I hadn't planned to before the call, but I think I've sold enough to at least, put a flyer out for it and see how it does. Because, it does seem like a reasonable way to hedge your bets. Because it does seem like, especially if you believe that Central Asia has upside, which I don't think it's hard to believe that it wouldn't in the resource dependent world we're in, then it seems like it's the right place to be. So I think it's very, very compelling story, Scott. Very compelling story. Sold me.
Well, if you
anyway.
have a chance to come over here, by all means, let me know. It'd be great to meet you in person and show you around. It would be good fun.
I'd love to.
How hard is it to get to know the president? Does he make himself available to foreigners?
That's a challenge, let's say.
Okay.
But
Something to
it's easy
work
to
on.
meet. Exactly, exactly. By the time you guys get here, we'll have that solved.
All right. Well, it's
All right, well-
it's a great story. So
Yeah.
we'll have all the details about the fund and all that at the end of the video, right, Matt?
Yeah, we'll put a link under the description of the video. I encourage you all to go check it out. Asia Frontier Capital also has a newsletter, and you've got a whole bunch of Twitter links and stuff like that people can sign up for. I'll link specifically to the Uzbekistan fund page, so people can go right to you. And there's a email address in there where they can reach out. Scott, I assume you respond with, or you have someone respond to any questions you get, and we'll go from there. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's great, Scott. I appreciate it. Like I said, I'll be reaching out because I'm interested, and hope some of our viewers are as well. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, guys. Good talking.
Okay.